and welcome to Encouraging Leadership, conversations that mobilize today's women leaders, with your host, Ann Miner. Meet leaders who share their observations, knowledge, insight, and perspectives to mobilize you to apply your own leadership in business and in life. Here's your host, Ann Miner.
Hello and welcome to Encouraging Leadership, where accomplished women engage in conversations to mobilize today's women leaders. I'm your host, Ann Miner, and today I have with me Michele Scanners. Michele is the Executive Director for Making Treaty 7. She has more than 20 years' experience in cultural leadership, strategy, branding, and development. She is a pianist and a contemplative, committed to integrating the arts and spirituality into her life and her leadership practice. Michele, welcome to Encouraging Leadership.
Thank you, Ann.
I'm so glad that you're able to be with us today, and I wonder if we could start off by having you tell us what values drive you in your work and your career.
Well, I said thank you like that. I should have added that this invitation from you to participate in this conversation. I would encourage all of our listeners to go through an exercise like this, because it makes you really reflect on what is important to you as a leader. Where have you had successes? Where have you had failures? And so for that, I'm very grateful. And actually, gratitude is, I might as well talk about it right now. I think that's one of the values. Well, one of the tools that I turn to is gratitude. I think that sometimes we forget to be grateful, and particularly in this country, we have so many things to be grateful for. I can go back a little bit later to the gratitude journal that I've been writing in every night for the last 20 years. But I think a really important value, and I'm going to change the word value to motivation, because as I reflected on this further, I think a turning point in my life was, when I had the opportunity to go to Harvard for 1 year. I was invited as a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, but I stayed on for another 3 years. I stayed on as an associate because I was doing some work in cultural diversity. Diversity is a big part of my work and my life. And then I decided to enroll in a master's in theological studies at the Harvard Divinity School. And, really? That's an interesting turn.
Yes.
For someone who's got an MBA and a law degree, right? By the way, people have said, Michele, I don't know, yours is less a career path than a career labyrinth. And yes, that's true, but there are reasons for that as well. So I got into this, and my concentration was in Buddhism. It was quite a departure from all the other education I'd had, but it allowed me also to take courses in other schools at Harvard and other schools in Cambridge. Leadership courses, negotiation courses, et cetera, et cetera. So it was almost like a master's in humanities. And it's very interesting that most of the Buddhist gurus and masters will tell you that everything rests on the tip of your motivation. What is your motivation? And that is a really important question for us and our audience as leaders. And just because you're not in the top role in a company does not mean you're not a leader. In fact, a lot of leadership happens outside of that designated position, because there's a difference between a leader and a manager. A leader is someone who actually makes things happen and motivates and mobilizes people. So motivation is key. And if you drill right down to it, I try to be motivated by, and this is a big job here, loving kindness and compassion for the welfare of all beings. And you might say, okay, how is that ever going to work in the real world? It's Calgary, which is where I live and make my living. But when you think about it, people may say, well, you're in the nonprofit world, Michele, I get that. You want to be, it's all do-gooder stuff, and you should be always in that kind of frame of mind. But when you think about the big issues that are facing facing Alberta right now, or facing, the energy industry, what is it that's got people all head up? It's environmental sustainability. It's safety. Well, what is that if not a lot of human beings that are concerned about the welfare of all beings? So if you knock things up a notch and maybe, fly at 60,000 feet to have a look at your life and what you're doing, that as a motivator, it becomes very interesting. And I'm just going to talk about it a little bit more because I also take it into my own personal life. If I want my relationships to work, if I want my family dynamics to work, and my relationships with my colleagues and my friendships and the people that I volunteer with, it's not a bad way to go, loving kindness and compassion. Now, where it gets tricky on a personal level is for the welfare of all beings. So that means, Michele, can't only be for your sister, your brother, or your best friend. It's got to be for everybody. It's got to be for those people that you're having, kind of a difficult situation with at work or on a committee or whatever. People that are kind of, get up your sleeve. So I would say that would be what motivates me, and the values that are important to me pretty well derive out of that.
Well, maybe you could give us an example of a scenario where you would apply loving kindness and compassion for all beings.
Okay. You talked a little. You mentioned briefly my role right now. I came into being the executive director of Making Treaty 7 because the two founders died in a tragic car crash. Okay. And the project, this was last February, a year ago, February 2015. This project is, it's very important, I think. It's a very important project to Alberta, certainly, but also to Canada, given that Indigenous relations and the question of reconciliation and decolonization are a priority for our Prime Minister, priority for our Premier here. What this project does, it's an artistic interpretation of the Treaty Number 7, which was one in a series of treaties signed across Western Canada in 1877 between Queen Victoria and 5 tribes of Southern Alberta. And so, ergo, I am, and I've done a lot of work with First Nations back in 2005, but never was immersed in it in the way that I was, right into the fire, if you will, on February 11th, 2015, when I was brought into this project. And talk about having to put to work every skill that I had learned at Harvard and along the way in 20 years of arts leadership and not-for-profit leadership. We were dealing, first of all, when we're dealing with First Nations, we're dealing with a world of people that have a completely different worldview than ours, and we'll get to that when we talk about diversity. But we're also talking about people who have gone through what we would never want anyone to have to go through, 400 years, or at least the last 150 years of, what happened in the West was first contact with the settlers, and then decimation of the buffalo, which meant their entire, their habitat, their food, their everything, because everything depended on the buffalo. Introduction of disease, so we lost 80% of our First Nations to smallpox and other diseases. And then introduction, of course, of whiskey and alcohol, which was very, very negative, had a very negative impact on First Nations peoples. And then the signing of the treaty, and then everybody ends up on reserves, and then we introduced residential schools. And we know, if we've been following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what happened there. So, when you're dealing with people who've been through that, generations of that, many people are motivated by their wounds, by serious wounds. And the only way that I could, and if you take on top of that the two leaders who died tragically and instantly, there was serious upheaval there. So this was a particularly challenging leadership challenge. And I had to be in my heart for most of those first 3 months, because if I had let my ego and my white person Western skills take over, we would have never gotten anywhere, and I think the project would simply have died, because it was just too complex, too complicated, and there were too many hurt people, including me, because Michael Green, who was the founder, was one of my best friends. So there were many instances where people were lashing out at each other, and I learned from the elders that when things become unstable, people behave in ways that they wouldn't otherwise behave. And we have to always have that in mind the minute that you're dealing with a crisis and there is instability. So another thing I try to do in my work is really try to establish stability and maintain stability. But I'm a creative, so I'm always taking risks. So it's hard to balance those two sometimes. But it is, you are trying. It's not the status quo. There's a difference between status quo and stability. And especially in the arts, where you have to take risks, you do need some level of stability. And art is an artistic project, but it's also a reconciliation project. So many, many instances, I have to absolutely, if there's an arrow thrown at me or someone else, I have to just let it go through me and just say, okay, I need to look beyond that as to how we're going to deal with this on principle and not on personalities.
Mm-hmm. That must have been difficult. One of the things I've heard people talk about is the difference in perception when it comes to time. How did you find that in the context of your work?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've learned so much about by dealing with First Nations people. We are motivated by time. I mean, let's face it, if you think about how you pretty well run your life, it's on the clock. It's what motivates you. When are we going on holiday? When am I getting my manicure? This meeting, that meeting, my workout, what's happening this weekend? It starts at 5, it starts at 9 in the morning. We run on the clock. First Nations people are not motivated by time. In fact, their calendar is nature. So when we talk about Indian time and people make jokes about Indian time, it's actually not. They're not on Indian time, and that's usually referred to, pejoratively as they're always late. No, actually, they're running on just not on a clock. They're running on their calendar's nature. They are motivated more by space. I think of them as weavers of time and makers of space, those are two completely different worldviews and world approaches. So if we're talking about diversity in leadership, and that's something I've done a lot of work in, that's something you have to accept from the get-go. And that's why working with diverse groups is so beautiful, because we're always learning. We're learning from the other. We're learning from the different, or what Jonathan Sachs referred to in his book, like the dignity of difference. We have to give dignity to difference. And it's how I find that really exciting, which you might be able to tell from, how excited I'm getting just talking about it.
So tell us more about where you've seen the dignity of difference at work. And I don't mean necessarily in the workplace, but I mean in the environment.
In my environment, in my workplace, it's so much fun because I'm always caught off guard, caught by surprise by something I had no idea about. For example, so we were sitting with our group last year, and of course, the death of two founders is an opportunity to, we have to revisit the strategic plan and the org chart and all those good things. A strategic plan, org chart, talk about Western jargon. So, my colleagues are kind of looking at me like, there goes that white lady again. But they like me, so it's okay. And many are Westernized in the sense that they're all operating, First Nations people are operating in this world. So I've got the use standard org chart up, and we're trying different models of organizational charts. And finally, our board chair just stood up and he drew the floor plan of a teepee. Oh, the floor plan of a teepee. And he just situated everybody around the teepee. So, the elders were the advisors, so they're always on the outside. And then you've got your counselors, so your board are sitting in one place, and you've got your stakeholders are in another place, and the artists are here. And then on the outside of the floor plan of the teepee, he very, artistically drew buffalo. And I said, that's so great. You've even drawn the buffalo. And he looked at me and he said, well, of course. He said, Michele, the buffalo are the funders. Well, of course they're the funders. The buffalo are what provides us with our food and our sustenance and our money, right? And they're the ones that keep the whole thing going. So, it's just how you think and how you see the world. And it's really fun to try to put yourself in the other person's world for a while and to see how they see it. Another skill that I want to mention, Anne, because I know our time is short, but if there's something that I learned at Harvard that will stay with me forever is the importance of listening. And this was brought up in every leadership course. It was a key part of our negotiation, the world-class negotiation courses at the Harvard Law School, comes out of the Harvard Law School, value creation-based negotiation. But listening, we spent like 3 days just on listening. But the best tool that I can share today about listening is it was in a course by Professor Otto Scharmer, who teaches at MIT. And two things I learned from him. One was presencing, and one was really like drill down onto how to really listen. And he talked about 4 levels of listening. And the first level is simply, level 1 is attending to what you already know. It's he refers to it as downloading. It's hearing what the other is saying without paying much attention. And we've all either done it or been victim of it. And that's when somebody's talking to you. You're talking to someone, but they're looking over your shoulder to see who's, coming in the door. Level 2 listening is where you're actually recognizing some new external fact. So there's a factual component to it. Level 3 listening is when you are listening deeply enough that you are trying to see the situation through the eyes of another. So that is touching on empathy. And then level 4 listening is where you're actually so deeply involved and engaged in the conversation that you're sensing some future higher potential for the other person or for the situation or for yourself. So it's actually generative. And when we engage in level 4 listening at in every one of our encounters, it's amazing what happens in our relationships. And that's a tool that I kind of go back to often when I'm kind of out of sorts or things aren't working quite well or they're not going my way. You know how we can get. Mm-hmm. And I'll just stop and say, okay, I really need to listen here. I need to listen to what they're saying and what they're not saying, right? I need to listen to body movements and I need to listen. I need to listen to what everyone else is doing in this room. So we can always be listening. We can be listening to the birds or listening to the other person, or sometimes, and most importantly, listening to the voices in our head, because they are many times our motivators. So that would be one tool I would I would like to share. And the other is what Otto Scharmer talked about in his course, and he called it presencing. It's a very important tool or skill for leaders. And that is, presencing blends the two words presence, the now, staying in the now, and sensing. And that's the capacity to just detect like what is to come. It's to sense the emerging future. So you're acting in a state of awareness in the now, but you're sensing, you're present, but you're sensing at the same time. And that's what an artist does. So it's very much an artistic process, actually. And I'm a pianist, of course, and I've sung in choirs and stuff, and I've been referred to as an artist in the boardroom. But I would encourage leaders to really think and not to think, to explore what it would be like to exercise an artistic process.
Which is one of the key things that makes you such a unique leader.
Well, thank you for that. It's it actually what happens is I end up in situations that are usually very complex and very challenging, but I love it because I'm a lifelong learner, right? Can we talk a little bit about diversity again?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, because and this is I'm again going to encourage people to look around the room, look around the tables that they're sitting at. And for women, it's particularly difficult. And if we're in a world that's and we know where the real challenges are in diversity. I mean, I get a kick out of some of my colleagues, and you have to kind of just embrace them, sort of, when they say, "Well, our board is really diverse." I mean, Jack golfs and Joe's bald and Jerry likes the opera and Jim's a big game hunter. Okay. That's not what we mean by diversity, right? If we do not surround ourselves with, particularly in a country now that reflects, I'd like to think, is reflective more and more of the global environment that we work in, which is a very culturally diverse environment. We need to have all those worldviews at our table. Because we can learn from that, and we will get different thinking, and we'll get better solutions. Diversity, you want to think of it in terms of leveraging diversity. And some people have said to me, "Well, how do you do that, Michele? Like, is it just you just token people?" When you're really practicing, trying to work in diversity, you'll find yourself working and having friends that are with different skin colors and that have, speak with an accent and have a different name than yours. And it becomes very easy to curate a committee of diverse people because they're all in your circle already. So that's when I feel when I'm really putting my money where my mouth is if I'm actually looking around myself, and not everyone is white,
Well, exactly, and that's the cognitive and intellectual diversity that people can bring, in addition to their ethnic, cultural, religious, and environmental heritage that they bring to the table.
Mm-hmm. And they can keep you out of some serious pitfalls, right? Like they can, or serious landmines, right? Because they know how the other thinks and what the other is expecting, right?
Well, that's very true, and I know that we both, probably more particularly I, have found myself in awkward situations simply by not knowing how others might view the situation. And so this idea of surrounding yourself with a diverse community and leveraging the benefits of that diverse community is certainly very powerful.
Yeah, and a big job of leadership is managing risk. And, if you don't know what you don't know, that's a big risk.
Well, it certainly is. And you can find yourself down a rabbit hole pretty quickly if you don't have that full spectrum of knowledge and wisdom available to you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Michele, tell us a bit more about the project. Tell us about Making Treaty 7 and how you're presenting it to the community. I know that you will have shows coming up, and perhaps our listeners would be interested in knowing a bit more about this and where they too could immerse themselves, perhaps practice presencing in the presence of Making Treaty 7.
Well, and it's interesting because the project really reflects a lot of what I've been talking about, and this was the genius of Michael Green. When Michael was tasked with the Legacy Projects for Calgary 2012's Cultural Capital Year, he said, we're going to do something really important that's going to bridge these two worlds because there's such a lack of understanding. And don't blame yourself, listeners, if you've never heard of treaties or you don't really know what the treaty was, because most people don't, and I didn't either. before I started this, where I had an idea, but not like I do now. And Michael just thought, you know what, we're going to do a major theatrical work that's going to focus on the true spirit and intent of that treaty. What did both parties come to the table with back in 1877? And then he proceeded to gather Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, actors, spoken word artists, poets, musicians, dancers, and they worked with elders for a year, and they did research, and they read books on the true spirit and intent and everything that had been written about that treaty. And together, they co-created this 2-hour incredible experience, powerful, that takes us through that bit of history I talked about earlier, from contact through to today. And it's a contemporary interpretation. But the reason it's so powerful is because 2 different worlds were working together. And again, that's what happens when you leverage diversity, right? Miracles happen. So it's beautiful. It's powerful. We're now engaging with schools. We've introduced school matinees. We're going to be engaging in research projects with the universities here, because everyone wants to see why and how this works to transform people in a short 2 hours. So I would invite our listeners, if you're interested, to come to our show, which is September 28th to 30th here in Calgary at the Grey Eagle Casino and Resort, which is on Tsuut'ina land. The 5 nations of southern Alberta are 3 Blackfoot, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, and then we have the Stoney Nakoda and the Tsuut'ina. So this production reflects from their views and the settlers and the newcomer views what happened and what are we going to do today, because we have to solve this problem. Treaty is about sharing space so that everyone comes out okay. You can practice that in your marriage, by the way. So making treaty is about how do we do that, and how are we going to do that today, because that treaty was a pact. It was not something that was signed and is over and behind us. It is a living, breathing agreement that we have to honor today.
Yes, we do. And I have heard it said of the production that every Canadian should see this production. And having seen it myself, I would say to you, every human being could benefit from seeing this production and walk away with a better understanding of others in general. And, of course, most particularly the situation with the treaty and our First Nations. But it was truly a transformative experience.
Well, I should mention, we will be in Ottawa on National Aboriginal Day on June 21st next year. So anyone in the East can travel to Ottawa for that at the National Arts Centre. Wonderful.
Now, Michele, where can people get more information? I'm sure that you have a website you'd like to share.
We do. We're on. It's Making Treaty 7, number 7. So Making Treaty number 7. You just Google that. But we're also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and join our mailing list. If you want, we'll send you a Making Treaty 7 button. But the mayor's got one, which is all good. So if people are interested, there's a lot of information on our website. And if there are educators in the crowd, we'd love to share what we've got going with you as well. And there are tools there. We use the scenes from the production as educative tools. So there's a lot on there for our listeners to go and have a surf through.
Wonderful. Well, Michele, our time is nearly up now, and I would encourage you to leave our listeners with one sentence that you think would help to mobilize them as they take their own leadership to new levels.
I'm going to use the line that we use in our show. We are all treaty people.
Wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Michele, thank you so much for being with us today. Listeners, I hope you will join us next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on boldradiostation.com.
Thank you for listening to Encouraging Leadership. To learn more about our host, Ann Miner, and the Acacia Institute, please visit acaciainstitute.com. Join us next week at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, for more encouraging leadership. In the meantime, be courageous.